means and its complexities and so on. So what I'm putting forward as some questions and unfinished thoughts, and I thought I'd thought about them, and I thought, what the hell, you're among friends, so it's okay. So I want to start off by asking why it means so much to us. Because I guess basically the notion of taking control and acting self-consciously and deliberately is important, and we want to feel that this is desirable, transformative, and positive. And I think what defeats us are the confusions that follow on this, because what we see is not always what we want to see. And I want to start off by telling you a story which comes out of the research work that I did on partition, and it's a story that I tell in my book, and using that as an example of the whole question of agency and what it means. It's a story that takes place in a village in what is now Pakistan, in what used to be undivided Punjab, but is now divided. The northwestern state of Punjab was one of the states that was divided in half when partition took place. And in one of the villages in this area, a village called Thoa Khalsa, there is in history and in media an iconic incident that takes place, which is that when the attackers come to attack the village, and in this instance it happens to be Muslims attacking Hindus and Sikhs mainly, the village elders, mostly men, some women, get together to have a discussion about how to protect themselves against the attacks, and take the decision that while the men can fight and perhaps get killed or fight their way out of it, the women and children are particularly vulnerable. And if they are picked up or caught by the attackers, they will almost inevitably be subjected to rape and probably made pregnant. And the pregnancy will then pollute the purity of the religious group that they belong to. And this is something that cannot be allowed to happen because it is an insult to the honor of the religion. So the men actually gather together several women and children and kill them. That's the first thing that they do. And then as the story is told, about 80 or 85 women sit down inside the temple, inside the Gurdwara, which is the Sikh temple, to pray, and then take the decision to take their own lives. And they get up and march to a well that is in the village and throw themselves into the well, in order that they will die the death of martyrs and therefore not be exposed to the attackers. Now the way that this incident is represented, and it becomes really, I say iconic because it fills the media at that time, it fills the literature that is written subsequent to partition, which is very experiential and grows out of the direct experience of this. And it becomes part of the first ever television serial on partition, where it is represented as something that is really heart-thumpingly heroic. There is an amazing religious bhajan. How do you explain bhajan?
Devotional song.
Devotional, yes. A devotional song written by a poet called Kabir that is sung in the temple, and the women sing it. And to the beat of that, they march to the well, and one by one you see them throwing themselves into it. And any number of films have been made subsequently which have used this dramatic device to prove the point that the women took their own lives. Now, to me, this incident, when I came across it in my research, raised several questions, and I want to put those questions before you. How do we read something like this? How do we read back into history a question which is represented as a question of complete agency, and yet the actors are dead, and the representations are almost entirely male? So how do we actually read this conflicted history? What can we make of it?
Repeat the question, please. I want to put it down.
You want to put it down?
Please. To understand what you want to read.
Okay. So I'm asking the question of how do we actually read or understand back, read back into a time that has gone past, a history that is represented as a history of agency, but we have no way of actually talking to the actors who perform that act because they are dead, right? So we really don't know whether to believe what it is represented as. Now, in the course of my research, I came across one woman who was part of these 85 women and who had actually survived because by the time she threw herself into the well, there was not enough water in the well to drown her, so she survived. The way she told me this history changed for me something about it, or made me think a little bit about it, because according to her, it was a history of both coercion and kind of voluntary. The person who inspired the women to jump into the well was a woman. And she was the wife of the headman of the village, who had quite a lot of authority and who actually led this group of women in. But among those women were young girls, women, and the question, of course, that you ask is, what could it have meant to them to protect the honor of the community, to protect the honor of the religion? Did they even know what they were doing, or was it just the community pressure that came on them? So, in a sense, the woman I met made me think about all of these things a little more, because up until then, I had actually basically only wanted to read this incident as an incident of victimhood, that all the women had been forced to take this step by the men. But everything I was reading went against that, and when I actually met one of the actors, it changed a little bit my perception of that, but not entirely, because it was quite clear that some were victims and some were not necessarily victims. So the thing that it did for me was to question my own assumptions about why we always wish to see women who have been subjected to such violence or who have performed a violent act like this as victims. What is it in us that wants us to look at that in this particular way? Okay, that's the one point that also the other question that it raised for me is about the ways in which we as feminist scholars, and studying conflict and studying wars and studying traumatic events in our histories, tend to look at the question of violence. Because to me, up until that point also, the understanding of violence had been, in a sense, I put this within quotes, fairly conventionally patriarchal. It was what people did to other people, and it was by and large what men did to women. But here were these women doing violence to themselves. And how were we to understand that? I don't know if it makes sense. These are very kind of tortured questions, which for me at that time really made me rethink this whole question. And the further complicating factor in this was that I believed then, and I still do, that if in societies like ours, like South Asian societies, let's say, or Middle Eastern societies, women are denied really any kind of agency socially, meaning they cannot choose what they wear, they cannot choose who they marry, they cannot choose what they eat often, they cannot choose when to go to the doctor often, all of these things. Then if we are to read these acts as acts of agency, how is it that we can accept that women who cannot make any choices are given the most important choice of all freely, which is to take their own lives? This whole question of whether suicides are voluntary comes up here, because you don't give any other choice, but you can say, she took her own life, and she took her own life to sacrifice for the community, for the religion, and so on and so forth. So it also made me question that. Then I began to look at all the sort of other work that people were doing, and came up against other things, which now I wanted to put this before you, that I began to understand this a little better because of another thing that took place more recently in in the last, I think, 3 or 4 years, which was a similar symbolic act of protest by women on behalf of their community and in relation to other women. And this was that in the northeastern state of Manipur, which is one of the states of the northeast which has been locked in a battle with the Indian state, A young woman was raped and killed by the army, which is in place there, which is entrenched there by a special act which allows the army unrestricted power, because that is seen as a zone, conflict zone. So the army can, for example, rape with impunity, and they will not be held accountable under the same law of rape that obtains in the rest of the country. So they had raped and killed this young woman, and in order to protest against her death, several women and women's groups marched up to the army headquarters and stood in front of it protesting. And in a completely spontaneous act of protest, 12 women who were all in their 70s, just stripped naked in front of the army headquarters, threw their clothes off and stood there and said, "Here we are, if it's women's bodies you want, come and rape us." So here was an amazing act of agency, really, an amazing decision that these women took. And these women are, if you meet them ordinarily, conventional mothers, dressed, several of them are widows, so they will be wearing white widow's clothes and so on.
And how old were they again?
In their 70s, all of them in their 70s. But the question that, the two things that came up for me then were, one was that this was clearly an act in which they took the decision, they took control, they took power in their hands to take that decision. And its symbolic value had an enormous impact, just in the same way as the symbolism of the women jumping into the well had an enormous sort of impact at that time. And yet, these women, who are known as the Imas, Ima is the word that's used for mother in that region, so they're known as the Imas. The Imas were making a protest on behalf of a political movement that has no space for them. Zero. I mean, it is really never considered women at all. So, what is the value or meaning of this act of agency? And I was reminded of Jean's point yesterday about the spontaneous response or the firefighting response of activism and the lack of the encompassing vision which might take that step a bit further, because the Imas clearly did not even think of that. So the sort of mainstream feminist response to that was a response which was very mixed, one of total admiration and appreciation, but also one that questions, A, using motherhood as a strategy, and B, not taking that questioning further at all, because basically what you're doing is lending support to a movement that really has no real space for you over there. Okay, then if you look, so now I'm jumping again to another kind of example. If you look at the involvement of women in war and conflict, or in conflicts in our region, and I'm looking particularly at India, as I mentioned in yesterday's quick summary, that there are a number of political movements in which women are now increasingly involved. And the kind of involvement they have is very, very different from what it used to be earlier. For example, in the 40s, we had a strong communist peasant movement in southern India called the Telangana movement. And in the Telangana movement, the women who were involved, there's been a book that we published long ago of interviews and oral histories of women who were involved in the movement, and time and again, what they say is that while they were taught to use the gun and while they took part in several of the actions, the major role they played was to cook and clean and look after the men and bear their children and give the children away, and really the mainstream of the movement had no space for them. Now, this is no longer the case, because the mainstream soldiery and factions and militants everywhere have made space for women for whatever reasons. Partly they've made space because they aren't able to recruit any more boys, but partly also they have made space because I think that they have found that women prove very good fighters, for example, and there could be a whole range of other reasons. Strategically, it's important to involve them. Feminists have by and large concentrated on looking at the sexual violation that women face within these movements, at looking at the ways in which patriarchy oppresses women within these movements. But what we have not looked at, and we've begun to look at now, is the ways in which these movements genuinely empower the women and give them a sense of agency and control, and give them a sense of being able to participate in something and bring them a kind of respect in their societies, because they are also able to go back. Even just the uniform makes a difference to them. So we haven't actually addressed that, because I think in a sense we have always believed or wanted to believe that women's agency is something that should always be positive, that it should always be liberating in a way, that should always lead to the kinds of values that we as feminists espouse and believe in. So I think, with increasingly we come across the participation of women as soldiers, as runners, and in other ways, and Saiba, when she talks about Kashmir, will talk much more about that. Similarly, in the kind of sectarian violence that has become so much a part of what the current day realities in India, where religious communities are pitted against each other and where violence takes place between religious communities. In the early days of this, what you used to see was violent incidents in which there were only men. Then you started to see that violent demonstrations would include a truck or two of women. And their presence would be used by the parties organizing that violence to create the impression, or to say that, look, we had women, so we couldn't have been violent. We had women participating, so it was actually not a violent, because they were taking forward the assumption of non-violence equals women, or women equals non-violence, and so on. Then we began to see the active participation of women, first in simply just the thefts and things like that take place when lawlessness happens, and they would, so if there was what we call a communal riot, women would rush to the shops and steal saris and that kind of thing. So it didn't seem to be such a serious thing, But then we began to see their active participation in the violence and their support to the violence. The fact that they, for example, in the Gujarat violence that took place in 2002, had it not been for women collecting supplies of gas cylinders and so on and so forth, stopping water being given to the people who were killed and dying, the success of that pogrom would not have been so major. It was very, very clear that women participated in it against other women. And this came as a major sort of shock to many feminists, not just Gujarat. By the time Gujarat came, I think this had become very clear to feminists in India that this was the kind of participation that you were seeing increasingly, and that here were women exercising a really, really violent agency. And what were we to make of this violent agency? And yesterday when I was talking, I spoke a little bit about the rise of the militant Hindu woman and the kinds of questions that her presence has raised for feminists. And I want to just remind you of those questions, because they obtain here also, because this kind of violent agency is not, even though the militant Hindu woman may be symbolically one woman or two women or some such thing who stand up and are seen publicly, but actually this is a widespread phenomenon. It's not something that is an individual phenomenon. So to see that kind of thing is something that really made feminists question their, I think now, what I call somewhat innocent assumptions, that we as women could have a commonality of interests as women that would supersede or transcend the divisions of class and religion and ethnicity and so on and so forth. And that things like nationalism and so on did not mean anything very much to women. And yet we were being forced to question these very assumptions in the process of seeing how women were exercising a kind of agency to participate very strongly in things that were strengthening nationalism, strengthening notions of community, strengthening notions of ethnicity, and so on and so forth. Finally, I want to just mention that another thing that yesterday again I made some mention of this whole business of consumerism, and I want to just remind you to keep that in your heads and while we're talking about this question. But I think that equally one of the realizations that came home to many of us was that we couldn't deny any longer, we couldn't any longer call it false consciousness, we couldn't any longer deny the fact that the pulling out of women into the public world by, say, political parties that are mobilizing women, right-wing political parties particularly, that are mobilizing women to enter their somewhat violent campaigns against other communities, for example, just to give an example, that this was not something that was giving women a sense of confidence and stepping and allowing them access to the public world in a way that they had never had before. In a society which is fairly, within quotes, traditional, where the large majority of women are locked within the four walls of the home, if exercising violent agency, if participating in violence is the thing that allows you to exit from the home into the public space and actually claim that public space in a way that is not threatening, because you are retaining your homes and marriages and going out and exercising this agency and coming back in there. It's difficult to deny that this has been strongly empowering for women and politically very strengthening for them, and in many ways very transformative for many of them. So how do we again look at the question of agency in this context? And really finally, I want to say that I don't want to deny at all that there is a kind of positive agency that women do exercise. And if you look at the roles that women have played in times of conflict, when they have been forced to come out of their homes and take over roles that otherwise might have been played by men, for example, just to use a simple example, if the men are dead, women have to take over the family economically and come out into the public world and take up things. And those roles have been enormously liberating for women, at tremendous cost, but they have been, and they have enabled women to exercise agency in a way that otherwise might not have been possible. I mean, in Delhi in 1984, you had pogroms against the Sikhs after Indira Gandhi was killed, and some 3,000 men were killed. And their wives, who had never actually ever stepped out of the home, were forced to take on public life. And today are confident women working in offices and so on and so forth. So they have been able to exercise their agency positively, and it has meant something very deep to them. So in a sense, I don't want to knock that aspect of it, but I just want to say that certainly in my own experience, looking at the question of agency really has raised a lot of the kinds of questions that I've been pointing to.